Welcome to this third plenary panel of IENSAM 2020. I am Sinikka Torkkola, Senior Researcher at Tampere University and chairing the panel. Our focus is on communication in the post-COVID-19 world, the world after so-called coronavirus. In this panel, we read COVID-19 from different perspectives, including the consequences of the pandemic. First, COVID-19 or any disease is a medical issue and a public health problem. Through the history, health and the risk of illness have been part of the control and construction of national states. Sometimes promoting public health creates awareness and wellness for the general population, but individuals still get sick and are sometimes discriminated because of their illness. Furthermore, capacity building for the public health divides countries into those which have resources to fight against diseases and those which do not have resources. As we all know, the world after COVID-19 is not the same as it was before. In this panel, we will discuss the unknown future. As communication and media scholars, we discuss the contribution of the media and journalism for human rights, civil society and democracy in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The first speaker is Sam Cuttle. He is a professor of media and communication at the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies at Cardiff University. His research focuses on globalization and the communication of conflicts, crises and catastrophes. Currently, he writes a book on history of violence and communication. Welcome, Simon. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to IMCR for inviting me. I believe I have just a few minutes to say a few words about this terrible pandemic, and I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about the pandemic in the context of global crises, and how I understand global crises and how it is imperative for us as communication scholars and indeed as citizens to recognize some of the profound changes in the world that I believe are embedded within and expressed in and through this latest pandemic. I want to talk about the context of the pandemic, and then I want to talk about some of the challenges. We've all experienced the COVID-19 pandemic from our own national contexts and perspectives, and I'm sure many of us will have a lot to say about the communication strategies and the forms of public relations that have been enacted and displayed by various governments around the world, and no doubt, and without any doubt, I think we will find all sorts of deficits and deficiencies in those types of public communication strategies, some countries seemingly performing so badly in comparison to others, and the consequences have been traumatic and devastating given the death toll around the world. So these are not light matters. However, we can also say that the pandemic that we are experiencing is not entirely unprecedented, of course. There have been a number of major pandemics in recent years, SARS and MERS and avian flu, even Ebola. And what we are starting to recognize, I think, from scientists and others, that these pandemics don't arrive out of nowhere. There is something unprecedented about them in the 20th and 21st century. And what that tells us is that these pandemics need to be seen as a form of global crisis, giving expression to the way in which the systems of late modernity produce challenges and stresses upon nature and in the environment and wildlife. And it can indeed produce an increase in what is termed zoonotic diseases, diseases that leap from animals into the human species. And that, to my mind, tells us something very important about the way in which the processes and systems of late modernity are driving humanity to the precipice of destruction. And therefore, it's absolutely imperative, as I say, that we contextualize pandemics in the context of globalization as a manifestation of the dark side of globalization, if you will, and that we try and make better sense of that in such ways. Now, a few years ago, I tried to think a little bit about global crises and how we might want to define them as a way of getting a fix or a handle on the nature of communications and how communications plays out within and through global crises. So here's a little quote that I wrote in an article in 2011, where I try and define what I understand by global crises. And I said that global crises are crises whose origins and outcomes cannot, for the most part, be confined inside the borders of particular nation states. Rather, they are endemic to, enmeshed within, and potentially encompassing of today's late modern capitalistic world. A deterritorializing world that has become increasingly interconnected, interdependent, and in flux. That is to say, globalized. Their impacts and tumultuous effects register through and beyond the porous borders of nation states, and for the most part require cooperative responses from civil societies and systems of governance that are no less transnational in scope. Now, we could talk about all sorts of different global crises, of course, and I have done in some of the publications that I've produced over the years, but it seems to me clearly that the pandemic that we are all confronting now is most certainly an instance of a global crisis, not simply in terms of the communication responses and the numbers of people who are affected by it, but because it's an expression of something much darker, much deeper in terms of how human society, world human society, has brought us to a place where we can now produce seemingly these zoonotic diseases that are going to reach such devastating impact upon us. They're not going to go away as far as the experts tell us. They are with us for the foreseeable future. So my starting point for thinking about communications then is really to think about the way in which these crises and the way they are being communicated really need to be seen as a wake-up call. They're an opportunity for wider civil society across the world to recognize the ecological devastation that our systems of production are producing in the world, which are in turn impacting upon human populations and will continue to do so. Now, there's a good side to globalization as well as a dark side, and I don't have time to unravel, if you like, the trajectory of human society over the last 3,000 years, which seems to me to be the meaningful time frame of understanding human society. So much has happened so quickly, and so much has happened, say, within the last 200 to 300 years only, that has brought us to the types of devastating impacts upon ecology, environment, and indeed human society. The good side is that, of course, that we have a developing global awareness or global consciousness that in part is fueled by the ethical and moral positions of religion. And we could talk about the origins of religion in human society, but so too could we talk about the deeper underlying quests for justice and equality, and that becomes embedded in part in the project of democracy and democratization, in humanitarianism in its institutionalized forms in the 19th century, human rights in the late 19th and 20th centuries, and then human insecurity in our contemporary world. And that journalism is part of this, that journalism, I know from the latest book I've written on the increasing number of deaths that journalists experience, that many journalists are motivated by the same impulses of the contemporary civil sphere that we all share, i.e. that there is a deep-seated concern to throw a spotlight on the inequalities and injustices around the world, including environmental despoliation. So let me just say a few words about global crises and the challenges that this poses to us. Firstly, as in the instance of the pandemic demonstrates, global crises are complex. They interpenetrate with other forms of conflicts and crises. So the pandemic is clearly also an economic crisis as well as an epidemiological one. It can produce increased conflicts. It can increase inequality. It can also be mobilized by political opportunists in discourses of race and ethnicity and exclusion. They are dynamic, that global crises unfold, they have a trajectory, and they are most certainly political, both in terms of the opportunity for increased political opportunism in a regressive way, possibly feeding into national populism, but so too do they become a moment for civil society reflection and reflexivity in respect of what this world that we inhabit has become and how we need to try and engage in those processes that seem to be like juggernauts driving us to the edge of destruction. They also, I think, from a research point of view, require us to step beyond the boundaries of what Ulrich Beck said, the great theorist of World Risk Society. We need to step beyond methodological nationalism. Yes, these political dynamics have unfolded differently in relation to different political systems in different countries, sometimes insanely so. If we think about the moral disgrace that the current president of the United States demonstrates, a moral problem of unprecedented proportions, I think, when we think of some of President Trump's interventions in the pandemic, but so too can we think of other national leaders. But we can't just focus upon the national responses. We also need to see this as a global problem, and we need to research it in relation to global communications. We need to take these global crises seriously, in other words. So ontologically, they are real, they are material, they are going to continue, and they are expressive of a globalized system or interlinking set of systems. They are not simply discursive constructs, they're not simply effective or symbolic ways of communication. They have a deep-seated underpinning. So philosophically, we might say they are critically realist, and we need to think of them as such if we are to engage sensibly. So epistemologically, we need to understand how communications play out in and through global crises, including the pandemic, but we can't take our eye off the fact that they are real and they will happen whether they are reported upon or spoken about or not. That raises methodological challenges for us, which we could talk about, but certainly so too does it raise ethical and I would argue political challenges for us as researchers, given the enormity and the unprecedented devastation that global crises now pose to us as a human population. We need to also think about our stance as researchers in relation to how we engage with those crises. It seems to me then, to sum up and to finish, that there are two trajectories, there are two ways of making sense, I think, of the global crises in a communication sphere. One is to think about the dark side of globalization that the pandemic represents in terms of late modern systems that are driving us to destruction, and the way in which those systems seem to be so entrenched, so based upon vested interests, that it will become increasingly difficult to dislodge them, or is very difficult to dislodge them. And that offers us a very pessimistic, I think, and dark way of making sense of the foreseeable future. Or the other way, and perhaps it's a complementary way, maybe it's a way of qualifying that dark pessimism. We need to think about the way in which civil society is, I think, in some quarters at least, starting to wake up to the reality of civilizational collapse that we are starting to witness and the pandemic, as I say, needs to be seen as expressive of that. So it's a global race to consciousness. I think the pandemic has become a further vehicle for that race to global consciousness. It's a wake-up call to the world, and as communication scholars and researchers, we need to use that reality as our critical benchmark, I think, when we start to interrogate the nature of communications. And I can hand back to our chair, Sinikka.
Thank you, Simon. The next speaker is Andri Katsekwo. She is a professor in Department of Communication Studies at University of Ghana. She has a practical experience as a journalist for 25 years. Her research focus is on the media and gender, media, politics, democratic governance, media and developmental imperatives, and media and conflicts. Welcome, Audrey. The floor is yours.
Okay. I just want to start by saying that we all agree COVID-19 is the biggest journalistic story in recent history. And I think we also know that covering outbreaks of infectious disease is part of journalism's responsibility and indeed its public interest mandates. And journalists have been reporting on this since the 18th century, 1721 Boston smallpox epidemic, the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, SARS outbreaks in Asia in 2002-2003, Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and later on in West Africa in 2015. We teach our journalists, our students, that the purpose of journalism is to, and I quote, provide citizens with the information they need to make the best possible decisions about their lives, their communities, their societies, their governments. So there's nothing particularly unusual that globally journalists are doing now that they haven't done before. And some have argued, indeed, that they are the frontline workers in this pandemic. They're part of the frontline workers. They are essential workers because of the role that they play. As with all major disease outbreaks, we know that the public's appetite is bound to grow for news and accurate information. And we see that in many countries around the world, especially during lockdown, the people have been glued to their television and radio sets, and reports show a sharp rise in audiences and online traffic. In some rural communities in Africa, where radio is still the only source of information, there are also reports of a surge in radio purchase, for example, in Burkina Faso. Paradoxically, though, COVID has increased demand for good journalism, but many news organizations are facing an unprecedented existential challenge due to a drop in advertising and other revenue streams. So this is making an already precarious situation for a lot of media organizations even worse. And like many other workers, the pandemic has also led to the loss of jobs in the media industry, even as the demand has grown. So some journalists remain in their jobs even though they haven't been paid for months, or they've had to take pay cuts or forfeit certain work benefits. We're hearing more cries, therefore, again paradoxically, for government to come and support journalism. And you know this raises all kinds of problems about journalistic independence. Pandemic, we know, call for trustworthy, timely information. That's what journalism provides. So when we think about media's contribution to the pandemic, it's one of the fundamental things they've had to do. But it also poses a challenge. And the challenge is in balancing the requirements of journalism to support and be an ally of state, communicating information from those managing the pandemic, and at the same time, not being co-opted or compromised or manipulated or becoming a cheerleader and therefore compromising your journalist's independent stand. Communicating the severity and urgency of the crisis also means that we need to communicate in ways that do not fuel fear and panic. And that's another balancing act that journalists all over the world are having to do. COVID-19 has also been about lockdown situations where people are expected to stay indoors. Again, this has meant journalists have had to work even harder to bring the news to people. They've had to be more creative in how they gather news. You cannot just simply put on lapel mics or use short mics when there's social distancing. You have to report sometimes wearing masks. You have to bring in a diversity of voices into your studios while working from home. And reporters and news anchors, we are finding out, are having to learn production skills in a hurry because they are the only ones that are dealing with all of the technology that will bring the news in the comfort of their homes, but alone, with no technicians. For those who still have to go out into the streets, the journalists, there are the challenges, including confrontations that have been reported with police and law enforcement lockdown officers, and not least, the risk of being infected themselves. Journalists have been bringing a multiplicity of actors and perspectives into their reporting, we find. They're having to be both global and local at the same time. And this, I mean that, the two are intrinsically linked, and the speaker before me has already talked about the global dimensions of the disease, but people are paying more attention to what's happening elsewhere to inform even their local decisions. Around the world, journalists are bringing multiple perspectives on the scale and the differentiated impacts of the virus. So journalistic scrutiny has eliminated, for example, how in Western countries, ethnic minorities have been disproportionately affected by the virus. In other places, notably in Africa, for example, it's how COVID is negatively affecting special needs education, the plight of other vulnerable groups, how COVID is fueling stigma in communities, how also journalists are highlighting endemic problems like informal settlements where there can't be any social distancing, where there's no running water, and which of course then means that those communities are particularly challenged. In a recent article by Kenyan journalist Wambui Wamunyo, she reminds us of the role new actors in the news and information space are playing. Vloggers, bloggers, social media activists, the alternate news sources and content providers who are shaping journalistic approaches by providing better access for ordinary voices to be heard. We also know that journalists are the vehicles of accountability. And so they've been scrutinizing governments and also the science community on how they're handling the public health responses, such as lockdown and quarantine, case management, providing PPEs and other resources, and how they're handling funding and mitigating the crisis. Journalists have also, during these times, exposed human rights abuses, police brutality during lockdowns, government arbitrary actions that threaten, and the threats that new legislation pose, and other emergency actions which threaten democracy as well. Investigative journalism. COVID-19 calls for robust investigative journalism on all kinds of issues, and some of investigative journalism networks have been very good at doing that. Drug supply chains, and following the COVID-19 money in Africa, or Ghana's Quack Doctors, which was a special that BBC Africa Eye and Anas Amaria, Anas, the investigative journalism, recently did. But then there are also other roles that I think I need to flag in this presentation, roles that call for providing hope, because there's a lot of despair. And so journalists are providing hope by simply showing what people are doing to respond and restoring our faith in our common humanity. And that's very important. So human interest stories, I contend, are just as important as stories that emerge from investigative journalism. And also they're providing a public service through educational broadcasting and online content, filling the void created by school closures that have resulted from the crisis. And this has been especially important in Africa. Radio schools have been established in several African countries, and new radio initiatives such as STEM Radio in Ghana, for example, which is supporting the study of STEM, science, technology, through community radio stations in peri-urban and rural areas. In Kenya, Citizen Television is helping primary school students to actually follow the curriculum in real time. And in Ghana, Multimedia, one of the media conglomerates, is also providing secondary school students with schooling in partnership with a digital platform. They launched that last July, but it's been given a sudden boost because of the pandemic. Last but not the least, I think, is the role that journalism has to play in addressing disinformation. You know, we've become keenly aware that pandemics are as much a public health crisis as a crisis of information, because of the abundance of fake news and fake news sources that have gone into overdrive during this pandemic. And of course, this year's press freedom celebration, World Press Freedom Celebrations, UNESCO highlighted the infodemic that fuels the pandemic, consisting of an onslaught of misinformation and disinformation that has spread as fast as the virus itself. And here's how legacy media comes in. They become even more important because they are the trusted sources of information. In Africa, for example, where community radio broadcasters are embedded within communities, they are even more trusted sources of information, and they are playing a really crucial role in debunking rumors, myths, information, because they are more likely to be believed than other sources of information. And I think we also need to remind ourselves of the role of media fact-checking sites and initiatives, both internationally, regionally, and locally, because we look up to them to also help in the verification process and to ensure quality journalism. So for us scholars in a post-COVID world, what should we be doing? I think COVID has served to remind us of how vital journalism is to the health of society. And I'm not only talking in the context of addressing disease, but in other ways, such as deepening democracy, respect for human rights, and participation. Also, COVID-19 is a reminder of the importance of science and health journalism and the deficit of expertise in that area, especially on the African continent. We need to increase also, therefore, the kinds of partnerships that can exist between scientists and journalists to strengthen science and health reporting. And so I'm reminded of initiatives such as The Conversation, which is providing well-researched, evidence-based articles for newsrooms. And I think we need more of those. We also need to reevaluate the skills we give to journalism students to better equip them to survive in a context that calls for them to have wider, broader media skills, to produce and share wider kinds of content, and at the same time to remain true to their profession. And finally, I think now more than ever, we need to address the uncertain future of journalism more squarely and explore new ways that will help sustain quality public interest journalism. So thank you all.
Thank you, Audrey. Next speaker is Claudia Lago. She is a professor at the School of Communication and Arts, Sao Paulo University. Her research interests are journalism, gender, and education. Welcome, Claudia. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Seneca. When I try to address my issue, that's human rights, civil society, and democracy regarding to COVID-19, I became hunting by this question because I think that it's a very complex issue, and I think that we are living the pandemic, so it's very difficult to see what will happen in the future. And I think that the pandemic is so changing our way of life so radically that it's very difficult to see all this issue with our way of thinking today, okay? But I will try stressing the relationship with human rights. So, what's new in the COVID-19 pandemic? I think that COVID-19, it's very important because it's really a global issue because of its fast propagation in a very connected world, as Simon pointed, and especially because the pandemic affects countries in the global north rapidly and in a very strong way. And I think that is the key to understand because what is the COVID in these days. So, but the COVID adds to existing challenges as the huge global inequality and the strength of authoritarian regimes. So this is the context where COVID is making his way, his path. What's old in the pandemic? As usual, the effects are being felt more intensely among the most vulnerable populations. As usual, the pandemic is showing the huge inequality in the global, in all the aspects, for example, in the educational aspects. The pandemic is gendered and racialized, and the pandemic shows that the idea of human rights as accessible for everyone is not true, okay? For example, in Brazil, the first two official deaths were a domestic worker and a porter who were contaminated by their employers. The employers were on vacation on Italy, and they are good, okay? But the workers died. So social distance is an example of the inequality. The OMS advocates the idea of social distance, and this idea in countries and in countries groups. For example, those who could follow the guidelines and did that, those who could but didn't because negationism and unscientific narratives, and these are all linked to these networks of fake news and so on. And most part of the people in the world that couldn't practice social distance because they just couldn't, like informal workers, people in slums, people incarcerated, people in refugee camps, and so on. Trying to think about democracy, I think that's nothing very new. Nah? I think that the pandemic amplifies existing threats. In the first moment, a lot of activists and scholars start to defend the idea that COVID-19 would be used as a pretext by governments to expand restrictive measures. And what we are seeing now is that this kind of behavior happens in countries that are not so fond of democracy. So what we are looking at this moment, because we don't know in the future if this is a situation that will persist or not, okay? What we are looking is that far-right governments, populist governments that used to treating democracy from within, because of their inability to deal with COVID-19, they are losing space. What happened with this kind of government and governance? I think that they couldn't pretend to care about people. And they expressed that in different ways, that deaths are expected, for example, if desired, to relieve the public system and economy. Of course, they say that in different contexts and different ways, but they said that, okay. And try to minimize the pandemic. Countries did that in the beginning, especially, but now there are countries that are trying to do that. Minimize or discredit the number of deaths. It's the case of USA and Brazil. An example about this kind of narrative. Brazil's both presidents, when Brazil, in April, when Brazil had 5,000 deaths of COVID-19, he was questioned about that, and he said, so what? Not my problem. I will not talk about Trump because some already point, but you remember the bleach suggestion, okay? So what this kind of government are saying, it's very linked to democracy and to human rights, is old and poor people can die and it's okay. But I think that this kind of narrative had the opposite effect. The social Darwinism became evident not only for those who suffer it daily, but to groups that until then felt safe. And this is very important. Nobody felt safe anymore. Because of that, I think that we can mapping a lot of reacts from civil society, especially regarding communication, okay? I think that we can think in some kind of reaction of a public sphere to combat official and non-official misinformation, like the fake news networks, to provide scientific information about the pandemic, to provide reliable information about the pandemic, and a lot of initiatives to meet vulnerable group needs, not only by person to help vulnerable groups, but from themselves. And that is very important. I really like this metaphor, and I think that we are living this kind of time, and when all that is solid melts into air. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic is highlighting the unsustainability of the world at all levels, not only ecological, social, and so on, and exposing our global inequalities. I think that the pandemic is showing that some ideas, such as the world cannot stop, are not necessarily true, what's good. And it's showing that we are all connected, whether we like or not, and it's good too. And it's highlighting that the care work, gender female, is essential to maintenance of life. My question is, will we learn from these lessons? And I really have doubts about that, but I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. The last speaker is Wai-Han Lu. She is an assistant professor of Department of Journalism, Hong Kong Baptist University. Her research focus is on journalism, new media, advertising, and public relations, big data, political communication, cultural studies, and aging. Welcome, Han Lu. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sinica. Thanks all for listening to our panel to share what's the impact of COVID-19 pandemic today I would like to share with you some of my observations about what's the impact, especially for the political leader, how they use the social media to interact with other international leaders, or how they use the social media to share their ideas. We know that it affects all different nations, and it is also has a great impact on the health crisis, because it influences many of our lives, and it also causes a great impact on our economy. And because of it, many political leaders are under a great pressure how they deal with these kinds of global crisis, because when they face the global crisis, they also face the pressure from the citizens. They are wondering what they can do to handle the crisis, and how they can be responsible for the government and for the people as well. So to them, it is a big crisis, and it influences all different aspects of the people's life. So to the political leader, because it is a presidential event, to them they want to find out the solution, but when they cope with it, you will find that many of them, they are not only want to think the causes or the consequence of the crisis, but they are also thinking about how they can find someone to blame, or how can they let their citizens to know their how they handle the crisis. So I found that when we talk about how they handle crisis, we have to know that in fact it's influenced by the populism as well. Why we talk about it? Because when we have a crisis, especially for the populist leader, they usually will raise the concerns of crisis, and they do not follow the appropriate rate of acting, and it is very important for us to know how they interact with the other populist leader, especially when we talk about how they interact. Now the logic of media has a lot of influence on it. For example, for the medium theories, they talk about it is a perspective that suggests every communications technologies has key physical, psychological, and social features that are relatively distinct and fixed, and that features shape how users of that medium progress information and make sense of the world. Why I talk about it? Because when we talk about Twitter, how they use Twitter to communicate, especially the populist leader. For example, many people will believe that like Donald Trump or like Xi Jinping, they are also the populist leader. When they use the social media, it seems that the COVID-19, usually when we talk about how they use the social media, it is more about how they use the Twitter logic to influence the citizens. Now, when we talk about like how Trump's use the Twitter, there are some features. For example, when we talk about like they use Twitter, it seems that it is more about simplicity. They make the whole crisis, the problem becomes very simple. So many media scholars talk about it promotes shallow information processing behavior. It undermines the capacity to discuss and to think about issues. For example, when Donald Trump, like in May, they just use one word, China. Okay, so to point out maybe the questions of a pandemic is China should take a great responsibility on it. I'm not saying who is now responsible for it, but it seems that when we use Twitter, that media, and when we talk about the global crisis, use that kinds of medium, it seems that it simplifies the story and make it very simple and let the citizens to understand it. Somehow it is good because it seems that they can easily point out the problem. But the other question is, when we talk about COVID-19, when we talk about international relations, it seems that we use the social media to simplify the whole story. And like this one, it is another quote by Donald Trump. Is talk about China could have destroyed our country economically if I didn't get elected. So it seems that it makes the story very simple. And the other features of Twitter is about where the message is very impulsive. That means it is emotionally charged message tend to be retweeted more often. So it seems that it makes the message very emotional. Like the number of this is one of the quotes: the number of China virus cases go up because of great testing. Okay, and well, the number of deaths go way down. The fake news doesn't like telling you that. So you can see that sometimes they use very like different like sentence to make the message very emotional. So you can also see that somehow their response are also more emotional as well. And other features of the Twitter is it seems that when we use that kinds of social media, more uncivil communications, especially in the past. If you think about the international relations, we usually have the speaker to handle, to talk about the global crisis. But now, because of the populism, because of the social media, you will find that more uncivil communication, even between the leaders, will appear. Like this one, this is by Donald Trump as well. As I watched the pandemic spread is a great pace face all across the world, including the tremendous damage it has done to the United States. I become more and more angry at China. People can see and you can feel it. So in the past, that kind of message, although it is very simple, it is easily understood by the citizens, but in the past, it won't be easily spread by themselves, or usually it will be formally speak out by the speaker of the nations. But now you can see that even the leaders of the United States or the leaders of others, they will just use their social media to express their anger or express their opinion as well. So it is quite interesting to see that these are kinds of background that you can see not when we talk about COVID-19, the global crisis. Now the media, social media play a very important role, and even the our great leader or our different leader, they will also use the social media to express their opinion and to handle. I think it's very interesting to know that they also use it to handle the international relations as well. So we also need to know some background of the Xi's major power, how she handle his international relations as well. So we know that Xi Jinping, after he established his administrations, he now promotes favorable changes for China's continuing development. That is the Chinese Dream. Okay, Chinese Dream. What does that mean? That means they want to use their power, both economic power and political power. In the past, they may just concern more on their local issue, but now they are now more concerned on international relations. And now you can see this the past Communist Party leader Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping. I don't know whether when you look at the picture, you will find that they look similar because they use the Photoshop to touch up the photo, because Xi Jinping wants to look more likely just like Mao Zedong, because it is the first leader of Communist Party in China. Because why he want to be? Because he want to have the personal worship himself, and that is a very important point. Because we are talking about, when we talk about Xi Jinping, he now is talking more about how he can spread out the emotions of the nationalism. So when we talk about nationalism, it seems that the technique they use is also they simplify the story. They talk more about how they can love the country. And in fact, when we talk about COVID-19, China play a very important role, because many people or many nations now, they are bringing that Xi Jinping or China is going to cover up the whole story of COVID-19 and make the global crisis more serious. Okay, and so you can see, but to Xi Jinping, you can see that because of, as I just mentioned, it is a populist leader. He tried to use this as a tool and has an opportunity to have the economic expansions. Like they talk about like they want to have a friendship with their like many different nations. Especially, I think it's more about the developing countries. They try to develop the friendship with them. And the second aspect is about like how they use this as a political opportunity to empower himself as well. For example, he will talk about now Xi Jinping is the greatest leader in the world because he shared his message with his citizens, talking about now China's, although he was China was once in the crisis, but now he can handle it very well. And he also talking about like they can provide medical supplies to the foreign countries, something like that. So they are not only using the talking about using promote their idea, but I want to stress here that now they try to use the social media, especially Xi Jinping, okay? They also use their channel to share all these ideas with their citizens, okay? So they simplify the story, just like what I mentioned, like Twitter, they simplify the story. They try to use emotional messages to share with their citizens as well. And somehow they also use it like just that kinds of message, like uncivil communications, to communicate with other nations as well. For example, you can see like the China's representative in France, they post a statement on its website accusing Western government of failing to protect their most vulnerable, letting the residents of nursing home die abandoned. So they really acknowledge their mistake in China, and they don't believe that they should hold China's accountable for the outbreak. So they are now, it seems that they are not not only about their own personal political crisis, but they try to shift their focus, especially about who are responsible for the crisis. So now I'm thinking when we talk about the COVID-19, how it's influenced the international relations, we can think about where are the leaders we need in a global crisis, because it seems that we are too busy with the great COVID-19 blame game. It seems that they use the social media and pass by, skip the journalists to have this blame game. So I think it is an interesting but very important phenomenon for us as a researcher. We can focus more on it, and also we can think about it as well. So thank you for your attention. So this is the end of my presentations.
Thank you, Han-Lu. Now we have listened to 4 different perspectives on COVID-19. And now it's time for the comments. Who likes to start?
Very interesting and very different perspectives, okay? I think that we address in very distant ways. I have a question to Simon. You point in your presentation that we have some kind of opportunities because of the crisis to learn something, okay? You finish with this proposition. My question is, what do you think we will learn? This is my 1 million question, because I really don't know. I really have doubts about that. So this is my question to you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you. That was an interesting talk by all of you, and thank you for the question. I think we're on the same page, you and I. I listened to your talk, and I think we share the same pessimistic hope, I suppose. It's a qualified hope. It's one that is contingent and dependent So this is about the politics of hope, isn't it, really, I think. The starting point is a rather bleak one for the way I see the world and the way I see human society and how it's now positioned. And I see the pandemic, as I said, is certainly an expression of that. But out of crises, not only are there opportunities for political opportunism and venal economic interests, as we're seeing with many of the world's so-called leaders, but we also see, I think, in the sphere of civil society, the emergence of a possible growing consciousness. Now that's multifaceted, I think, and sometimes it's reversible as well. I think people living in lockdown, at least in Britain, or at least many people, it's only anecdotal from my own experience, but I think actually living in lockdown for a considerable period of time for most people, over 100 days, has given people an opportunity to step outside of the normal work routines and practices, and maybe also the normative culture that is associated with that, i.e., and a culture of work, of progress, of constantly running forward and trying to amass more material stuff. This has been an opportunity for people to reflect on their own individual lives and families, to rediscover something about themselves, and sometimes to creatively flourish. I'm quite interested in the world of music, and I play a little bit of guitar, or try to, and I've been struck, for example, by the numbers of people who have gone online virtually to engage in musical activities with others. But so too, these types of opportunities to have Zoom meetings with people all around the world. It's incredible, I think, just incredible, the sharing of worldviews and different cultural outlooks and values. I guess to try and answer your question more explicitly, what I would really hope, really hope, from the bottom of my heart, would be that this questioning of rapacious economic growth and development, which is bringing the world to destruction. And I know this sounds very catastrophicist in its saying, but it happens to be true, I think. I see this as an opportunity for people to recognize that the way of life that we are so embedded within really has to change, and that we really need to think about quality of life and not about quantity of stuff so much, to put it simply. And I know that some people have started to think in such ways, and that the pandemic is simply part of a growing ecological awareness and consciousness. Now, that's not widespread, I don't think. And as I said, it can also be reversible, which is disturbing. I see more pandemics coming our way, and I see further types of economic and other types of global crises manifesting themselves in quick succession. Climate change is the huge one that really needs to be considered. And the pandemic was an opportunity, I think, for government leaders to step up to the plate of awareness of climate change, given the enforced enlightenment, that's a phrase that Ulrich Beck uses, the enforced enlightenment, in other words, the awareness of the impossibility of continuing carbon emissions and economic growth. Some leaders have recognized it, most haven't, and indeed some leaders see the pandemic, I think, as an opportunity to further their own economic interests, resulting, for example, in the destruction of forests, environments, and as a way of increasing economic material wealth for some at the expense of the lives and livelihoods of others. So dark pessimism, but tainted by an awareness that disasters and crises can sometimes unleash political forces that are more progressive. Naomi Klein wrote a very good book a little while ago called Disaster Capitalism, and how capitalists and venal interests will capitalize upon the shock of a disaster to further their own economic interests. But there is also some evidence to suggest that, and I think some of you have mentioned this, that crises give us an opportunity to reflect on the politics and the type of leadership that is required and the type of civil society engagement that is required as well in order to try and produce a better world. What was it Antonio Gramsci said? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I think that sums up my position, and that's how I would answer your question, I think. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Can I drop two, I would add 2 drops of pessimism in your comment. When, first of all this isolation that some people are experiencing and made possible to them to reflect is possible to only a few people in the world, if you look at the world, okay? Major of people are not doing that because they couldn't. This is a drop of pessimism. And another one is that is horrify me. Open some shops and going to the shops massively as never happened before. So this, I think, it is a drops of pessimism. But okay, I really hope that we can learn something.
Yeah. And could I ask you the same question in return, in the context of Brazil? How is this unfolding politically, given the very strong and negative political context, I think, that Brazil is experiencing or suffering from? What signs are there? What seeds of hope, if any, can you discern?
I think we have, because the inability to do this populist government, and populist is an euphemism, government to deal with the COVID-19, make this government be in the stake. So this is something good. And we are seeing the reaction from civil society. And I can make a question to Audrey because it's related to that. We are seeing that a lot of initiatives from civil society to fill the gap because the government is doing nothing. So the federal government. So we are seeing a lot of civil society initiatives. For example, when the government tried to not to show the numbers of COVID, the media made some kind of consortium to look at the state's numbers and combine to present to public opinion. So they substitute the government, the data from government. And it's very, this never happened before. And I think that this is very interesting. People are going to streets to manifest, to protest, using social distance. It's a lot of movements doing performs in streets using social distance. It's very interesting what's happening now in Brazil. It's refreshing. I don't know what's happened in the future, but for now we are we are happy that what is happening because of the reaction from society. And my question to Audrey is that you talk about journalism initiatives and official journalism. What we are looking and seeing in Brazil is that we have a lot of non-official initiatives from from civic journalism, for example, or civil media, not only journalism. What is important in Africa? It's the official journalism or journalists that are based on journalist marketing, or the civil society doing journalism. How are you seeing that?
Okay. All right, thank you. I think both kinds of journalism are needed and are important. The legacy traditional media journalists who actually have a bigger sort of infrastructure to provide news and information, and have been doing it for a while. But at the same time, we are seeing, as I mentioned in my presentation, alternate sources of information, the vloggers, the bloggers, the social media activists who are putting out stories out there. And in fact, there are two initiatives that perhaps I should remind us of. There's one called The Elephant, and then one called Africa Uncensored. They're examples of new actors in storytelling from Kenya, for example, and they give voice to non-elite voices, much more than your traditional legacy media that often go to official sources to tell their stories, and in fact to challenge official, some of the official information coming out. And then you get pressure groups. I am reminded that just last week, a pressure group in Ghana called Occupy Ghana, and I guess they have an alliance with the people in the medical field coming together to challenge how the numbers are being reported, how the cases are being reported, how many recoveries and how many deaths, pointing out that the reporting of deaths was underreported. And it sort of put pressure on government to begin to present the figures a little bit more differently and to give more explanation as to how it is that we're reporting in this manner. So there are all of these civil society initiatives. There's Global Voices, for example, is a more international civil society initiative that is commissioning journalists and other people to tell stories and to delve deeper into what's happening in different countries on COVID. So there's a lot of that going on. I wanted to ask Janet a question. Fairly or unfairly, China is being sort of blamed in certain places as having been the beginnings of the pandemic and not leveling enough with the rest of the world. And so there's a lot of criticism, there are a lot of stories. In fact, I'm reminded that CNN did an expose a couple of weeks ago, perhaps focusing on China. How is there any critical reporting at all coming out of China on how the pandemic has been handled?
I think it is a very good question, because when we talk about the civil society, we also thinking about how China whether they can have a civil society, they can have a critical report. But in fact, in China, you can see that there are many reports talking about that, especially inside China, because of the internet control. It seems that even though like the doctor, they want to even at the very beginning, they know there is a pandemic. They want to share this news with their colleagues. They will also face the arrest, and also they will also face many challenges, because like the police or the colleagues will report the case and ask them to silence. Okay, so it is a big problem in China, especially you have to imagine, especially because when we talk about technology, in the positive side, we always talking about the technology can help us to promote the civil society, can have let more voice to voice out and have a more critical like report or like investigative report on for what's happening for the government. But in China, it's totally opposite, because the tight control of the China government, especially they use the technology. Now they are not only using the internet to monitor, especially when they use the internet. You have to know that they use the mobile and all the like internet money, okay, or internet system to handle all the economic issues, such as when they buy things, they have all the records. So it seems that they have monitored at many different levels. So it is very difficult for the citizens to voice out. Although there are some reports they leak out, and so that I'm also thinking why Hong Kong, you can see that Hong Kong, it seems that the influence, it seems that it's so close to the mainland China, right? But it seems that why they can still take some precautions before the outbreak of the pandemic. I think it is because some critical reports can also appear in Hong Kong during that time, especially at the very beginning of the pandemic happening in China. But the problem is that kinds of news cannot be spread to the world, or maybe it seems that it is so far away, so the other countries are not really aware of what is reporting in China or what's reporting in Hong Kong. That's why it seems that although there are only a few reports like reported by the citizens or reported by the Hong Kong journalists in mainland China, but it seems that it cannot raise global awareness. So to prevent the spread of the pandemic. Yeah. So Audrey, I also have one question because you just mentioned you believe that like during the pandemic, we need to have a new skill for the journalists, right? So what do you think? What kinds of new skill they are required?
Okay, I'll point to one skill. Well, a couple. One is that they're more able to do many things at the same time. We tend to teach our journalists in little silos. We're getting better at it with multimedia journalism, but we tend to have our students concentrate on a particular aspect of journalism. But I think that they need to have a little of all of those skills. Like I said, some anchor persons found themselves at home having to deliver the news and managing the technical aspects of that as well, you know, and they hadn't sort of prepared for that sort of thing. But also, in a presentation I did recently, I was pitching the idea of doing more visual stories that connect with people. Of course, we do visual stories where in broadcast journalism, but using much more visualization in infographics to simplify things, and thinking of ways to bring the story home with much more photography. One of my criticisms, at least in terms of African journalism and where the investments have been, is how little we're investing in photojournalism, for example. In fact, it's, you know, photojournalists are the first to be cut from newsrooms, and a lot of them are struggling to survive. But we ought to bring back those arts, because I think that people can connect with them, especially in times like this, than, you know, perhaps longer, you know, words and pieces that we tend to do.
Thank you all. We had wide-ranging discussion. To summarize it, I see there are two conflicting viewpoints of media and communication in the context of COVID-19. On the one hand, there is a growing need for the health education, health communication, and health journalism based on medical facts. On the other hand, there is more and more space for fake news, misinformation, and disinformation, challenging those facts. Something that UNESCO has named Infomedic. This discussion will surely continue, and I invite you all to join the conversation on the conference site or via Twitter. The hashtag is IAMCR2020. Welcome.